Hello, everybody. I'm Frank Newport.
And I'm Nate Brantingham.
And we want to welcome you to our Objective Religion podcast, produced in partnership with Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. And today on our podcast, we are going to talk about the fascinating topic of geography, where we all live across these 50 states plus the District of Columbia.
And connect that geography with religion. And we know, just like how there's language differences across the 50 states, that there's also perhaps some big differences in how people worship and the religious faith. Is that right, Frank?
Indeed. We know there are big differences in religious identity across the world. No great shock. You're not going to find a lot of Buddhists and Hindus on a proportionate basis in Western Europe or in the United States. You're not going to find a lot of Catholics on a proportionate basis in India or in China. We know very well that people practice different religious faiths and faith traditions across the countries of the world, and that's no different here in the United States. In terms of the brand identity of religion, there are big differences. Way up in the upper Midwest, we have a lot of Lutherans. We have a lot of Catholics in the Mid-Atlantic states. We have a lot of Protestants down in our southern states. We have a lot of Mormons, adherents to the LDS faith in Utah and in Idaho. So the idea that, Nate, there are different brand identities across the states is well established. That doesn't shock us at all.
Right, but our main focus this time is not just on what faiths people worship, but just how religious are people? What is their differences in religiosity across regions and from state to state?
Indeed, and that's what we're going to look at, as you say, not the differences in the faith you adhere to, but in how religious you are. And right now, we can tell you that we do find big differences across the United States. And you know, that's the focus of this podcast, Nate. We're going to be trying to look at these differences, states of the Union, some states being extremely religious, some states being not religious at all, based on the average religiosity of the population. And then we're going to try to find some answers for why that might be the case. If I wanted to give you a big picture of this, just looking at a map of the United States, it's pretty straightforward. The most religious states, the states where religiosity is high, you'll find people in churches, you'll find people saying that religion is important to them in their daily life, is across the South, the Bible Belt. We also find Utah is one of those states where we have very high religiosity. And then when we look at the corners of the United States, the northern corners, the Northeast and the Northwest, we find very low levels of religiosity. And we also find low levels of religiosity in some other Western states. So we have big differences across the regions of this country, not just in the types of faiths people identify with, but in religiosity.
So getting this a little bit more specific and breaking it down, what is a top 10 list of the most religious and least religious states in the Union?
I want to make it clear that what I'm using here is my metric is a combination of ingredients products, so to speak, that we use at Gallup, where we divide everybody up into those who are highly religious, moderately religious, and not religious at all. And that's based on a combination of self-reported religious service attendance, how often people attend church, mosque, and synagogue, and a separate question which asks, how important is religion to you in your personal life? And then we put those two together and divide the world into three categories. And right now, in answer to your question, Nate, I'm going to be looking at the top 10 states in the Union based on the percent of the population that are highly religious. And as we just talked about, most of these, but not all, are in the South. Mississippi has the honor, as it has for many years now, of being the most religious state in the Union. Mississippi at number one is followed by Alabama, and then Utah, not a southern state, then Louisiana, Arkansas, South Carolina, Tennessee, then Nebraska, a Midwestern state, sneaks in there, then North Carolina, and then Oklahoma. And then when we go to the top 10 least religious states in the Union, we start out in that northeast corner of this country, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire. Those three New England states are the least religious states in the Union, followed by another New England state, Massachusetts, then Nevada, Oregon, Washington State, District of Columbia, that's very interesting, in the top 10 least religious states, and then Hawaii, Alaska, and California. So as I read those states off, Nate, it's pretty clear that the least religious states are out in the West, up in the Northwest, and up in the Northeast, up in the New England area.
And these differences are really substantial. So Mississippi's coming in at the highly religious 59%. Vermont, same measurement, 16%. So there's a massive shift between the top and the bottom here.
Absolutely. Sometimes we find differences and they may be statistically significant, as we like to say, but they're not substantively significant. That is, there's not a huge actual difference. But in this case, as you alluded to right there, Nate, these are hugely different on a substantive basis. The 59 versus 16, I think, tells the story there. 59% of residents in Mississippi are highly religious and only 16% in Vermont. That's a huge difference. You can look at it the other way around. We have 59% of residents in Vermont that we classify as not religious at all. And if you go down to Mississippi, you only have 12% of the population that are not religious. So these are major, major differences. Some of the biggest differences we find across the states of the Union on almost any metric that we look at.
One of the outliers that jumps out at me that I find is fascinating, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, is Utah, which has a difference in the way that it's outlaid. It has high religiosity, 54%. Then it drops all the way down in the moderate category to just 16%, and then bumps back up to 30% for the not religious. So unlike all the rest of the states, this one you either are or you're not. There's not much in the middle.
That's right. Utah is a very fascinating state, given its Mormon history. The state was settled in the 1800s by Mormons who were fleeing persecution in the Illinois area and before that up in New York State. And they came out to Utah and settled. And Mormons are the most religious faith tradition we have in the United States. That is, they attend church more frequently, based on what they tell us, more than the adherents to any other brand identity. So when you have a lot of Mormons in a state like Utah, you're going to have a lot of people who are highly religious. But Utah has experienced a lot of growth recently. A lot of non-LDS people have moved into the state, and they tend to be not religious at all. So you have that bifurcation there that you just talked about, with a lot of highly religious people in Utah, but they're living side by side, so to speak, in Utah with a lot of people that are not very religious at all.
And that ties into the data that you have on church attendance, too, because that LDS population you say is highly religious is going to drive Utah up to the top of the charts in terms of church attendance, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's interesting to our listeners to look just at this one variable, church attendance, which, as I said a moment ago, is one of the two variables that we put together to come up with our highly religious, moderately religious, not religious at all metric. But it's interesting just to look at church attendance per se. And this is based on a question where we simply say, generally speaking, how often do you attend religious services? And we classify people that go weekly, nearly weekly or monthly, and then people who seldom or never go. And on this measure, as you just said, Nate, it's not Mississippi at the top of the list, but it's Utah. 47% of residents of Utah say, on average, they attend church on a weekly basis. But then on the other hand, 37% say they seldom or never go. The other states where people are very high in church attendance are the ones that we would expect based on the list that I read just a few minutes ago, other southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and so on and so forth. But again, these differences are huge, Nate, in church attendance. Let's take Vermont and New Hampshire. Vermont, 12%, let me repeat that, 12% of everybody that we interviewed in Vermont when we compiled these data said that they attended church on a weekly basis. And take heed of this number. In Vermont, 71% of the residents and 67% of the residents in New Hampshire, the neighboring state up there in New England, say that they seldom or never go to church. 2/3 or more of these New England state residents say they seldom or never go to church. And when you're in Mississippi, that's just a quarter, 26% who say they seldom or never go to church. So it's just a huge difference in church attendance. You're just not going to be bowled over by hordes of people trying to get to churches up in Vermont and in New Hampshire on Sunday morning. If you're in Mississippi or in Utah, you're not going to be surprised to see a lot of people going to church if you're in those states on Sunday morning.
So I've never been to either Mississippi, which is the most religious state in the Union, nor New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine, the least religious states. And I'm sure that many of our listeners haven't either. So we thought it would be fun to take this opportunity to get kind of an on-the-ground view of what religion looks like in those states from people who actually live there.
We're talking now with Dr. Brent Barker, Senior Pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Grenada, Mississippi. Brent, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
You've been in Mississippi for a while now, pastor of this particular church for about 10 years, right?
That's correct. December will be 10 years.
All right. And we're grateful to have you with us today because we're talking about religiosity in the United States and how it varies widely between the states of the Union. And Mississippi, where you're located right now, has the honor of being the most religious state in America of all the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, at least based on our Gallup data.
Yes, I've reviewed that data that you sent, and
All right.
it's always nice to be on top when it's something good.
That's right. That's good. So you said it was 17,000. Is that about right for the population?
Yes.
And do you know about roughly how many churches there are across that 17,000?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 120.
Wow.
Or so, yes. Literally a church on every corner. And
yeah.
When I grew up in North Carolina, I went to school at North Carolina State University. Hardee's was founded in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and it was said that you could sit at one Hardee's and see 5 others in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Well, you can sit in a restaurant in Grenada, Mississippi, and see 2 or 3 churches within eyesight, just being in one location. So there are churches, lots of churches, small churches, all around, and large community involvement among pastors. The most recent one that we've been focused on in Grenada, we're building a 150-foot cross to place out on Interstate 55. There are several crosses throughout Mississippi that have gone up in recent months and years. Eupora is south and east of us. Winona, most recently Batesville, hoisted a 150-foot cross that had a crown of thorns on it. And so Grenada is following in line with that. And so we have a community team, that steering team, if you will. And let's see, there were 4 out of the 7 members, 4 of those were pastors. And it was a diverse group of pastors, denominationally and racially as well. And so the community really is bent toward receiving leadership from spiritual leaders and local pastors in particular.
We're talking with Dr. Andrew Smith, who is the director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, and he's been there for over 20 years in New England. And since he is a student of residents of New Hampshire and New England, we thought it would be great to talk to you, Andy, and get your input on religiosity way up there in the Northeast. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the data that we've been talking about on our podcast today clearly show that Vermont and New Hampshire usually come in as the least religious states in the nation, sometimes along with Maine and some of the other states, but sometimes it's a battle between New Hampshire and Vermont as to which one is the least religious, and that's based on church attendance and self-reported importance of religion. You do lots and lots of surveys up there. Does that comport with your data? You found over the years in your surveys that New Hampshireites, New Englandites are not very religious?
It absolutely does fit in with what we're seeing up here in our polls. We've been asking people a religiosity question, that is how often they attend church services. Right now, only 25% of residents in New Hampshire, adults in New Hampshire, say they attend religious services at least once a month. And over 45% say they never attend church services. So this fits in very much with what we're seeing in our polling.
The thing I would like to know, because I have not been up to the far northeast of the United States, is what does that look like on the ground? I can conceptualize the numbers, but does it just mean they're just not churches, or there are churches, but they're empty, but they used to be full? Like, what does it look like on the ground?
Well, I think you have to go back historically and remember how New Hampshire and the other New England states were founded. The Congregational Church is predominantly has historically been the most popular church here. This was founded by Puritans for the most part. And in pretty much every town throughout the state, there's at least one Congregational Church or United Church of Christ now. What it means is those churches are largely empty, but that's not unusual because we've seen since the 1950s that the mainline religions all across the country have been losing adherents. It's just in New England, that was the major church. So when you lose a lot of adherents to your church, you've largely lost some of those denominations. But even the Catholic Church up here, which is more recently populated by largely immigrants, Irish and Catholic immigrants coming into the Boston area, then expanding into New England, they are not very well attended either. So if you drive past a church in New England, the only ones that you will see with significant numbers of people are the few evangelical churches that are up here.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me. Would there literally be no cars, or actually are the churches defunct? These famous steeples that we see in New England, there's nobody there. They've been turned into restaurants or bed and breakfasts, but there's literally no cars in front of a lot of these churches on Sunday.
A lot of them have been converted into other things, from daycare centers to people's houses, et cetera, restaurants. The Catholic churches have been shutting and combining churches across the state over the last decade or so. And I wouldn't say that the churches that are remaining, particularly the mainline churches, are empty of cars, but very, very few, and certainly not what you would have seen 30 to 40 years ago.
So what happened in those 30 to 40 years? I know it happened across the United States, and we did a podcast on that, but what happened that make that last 30, 40 years hit especially hard up there? Or is it, as you were saying before, it was just the denominations that were just the ones that got hit? They're susceptible.
I think it's largely across New England, and it's largely the same denominations that dominated all of the New England states. If you look at the data that Gallup is in reporting, I think all 6 New England states, with perhaps the exception of Rhode Island, which has a heavy Catholic population, are all in the top 10 or the bottom 10, depending on your perspective, of the least religious states in the country. So I think this is not unique to New Hampshire, but more symptomatic of the historical development of all the New England states.
If you had to answer the question, one question, why is New Hampshire so non-religious? What would your answer be, Andy?
I'd say there's multiple reasons. First off, I think you have to look at the migration patterns into New Hampshire. New Hampshire is really the only state in the entire Northeast that has significant population in migration and significant population change. I can illustrate this by just looking at some data that we did between 2016 and 2020, so over 4 years, 30% of the potential voters in the state are different people. About 11% were people that were not old enough to vote in 2016, but 19% were people that moved in from other states. And we see in our polling that younger people are less religious than our older people. They're less likely to go to church. And also we've seen that the people who just recently arrived to New Hampshire are significantly less religious as well. So I think it's a combination of this migration of people into the state, the fact that there is this generational change, and I think other countries have seen this. If your parents stop going to church, the odds of a child going to church drop dramatically. I think these things have conspired to result in this very low religiosity in New Hampshire.
But does that imply that non-religious people are more likely to move to New Hampshire for whatever reason?
No, I think what's more likely to move to New Hampshire twofold. First are people that just are moving across the Massachusetts border largely to get a cheaper house and escape some of the taxation there. But secondly, it's the New Hampshire economy is driven largely by jobs that require high levels of education. So we've got, for example, more people working for a Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, which is based in Massachusetts. More people work here than work in Boston. So a lot of these people that have filled these high-end jobs that require high levels of education have come from other parts of New England, or excuse me, of the Northeast. But those people with high levels of education are less likely to be religious. I think some of your data have shown that across the country. They are less likely to attend church. So I think the migration pattern is that the people that are most likely to move here are people that are less likely to be religious. Not that they're moving here to escape religion, it's just that those two lines of influence converge when they move.
I've heard it said when you move to a new place, you either got to find a church or a bar to fill that social need. Where's that social capital resting to if it's not landing in churches? Where does it end up?
Difficult to say. You could point to the bars. New Hampshire does have, I think, the highest level of liquor consumption as measured by sales in the country, but I think that's misleading because we have the foresight to build interstates with their own exits for liquor stores on them, so to catch all of the tourists coming through the state. But there are a lot of bars and restaurants. It is interesting. You do see other examples of quasi-religious activities. So you see a lot of book clubs, social meetings, politically inspired meetings, political house parties. One of the other things about New Hampshire is that we have more elections than any state in the country. Our entire legislature is elected every 2 years. The governor's elected every 2 years. We have town elections every year. And then you throw in the primaries associated with all of those things. We're having elections all of the time. So the political infrastructure in the state is fairly robust. And a lot of people, essentially are getting their social activities that might have been boosted before by religion through politics.
Nate mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to come back to it again. Trends over time. On a relative basis, of course, the United States has become less religious, at least on some measures, but has New Hampshire held this position as being one of the least religious states in the Union over time? Even if the tide is rising or lowering overall, we haven't seen some kind of dramatic change to your knowledge, have we, Andy, where 50 years ago, New Hampshireites were very religious and suddenly they became less religious? Is this kind of a cultural trend that we've seen for decades and decades and decades?
I think it's part of a cultural trend that we've seen for decades, but we probably started at lower levels of religiosity than many other states did. Since I've been here, and this goes back to 2001, when we first started measuring and asking this question, 24% of New Hampshire adults said they never attended church. That's up to 45% now. So it's been a steady increase over the last 20 years. So I think that probably mirrors what we're seeing in the country. It's not been any one single event or a stark event. It's just been a steady decrease in church attendance that's been going on for decade after decade after decade here.
And historically, I know we don't have data going back that far, but going back to when it was founded, and we have the stories of the Puritans and the people writing for religious persecution and then bringing the religion and faith with them. Sounds like the start was very religious. And then either it must have migrated out or it didn't transmit from generation to generation. It just kind of dwindled over the years.
New Hampshire has an interesting history compared with other states in New England. It originally was part of the Massachusetts colony and was separated off in the 1640s or so. And New Hampshire was always seen as kind of a rogue state. The port of Portsmouth was seen as kind of a quasi-piratical, and we had a lot of people that were doing business to get around the governor, the state governor, as well as the crown governor. So New Hampshire's always been on the frontier and has had less of that religiosity than many other parts of the country, simply because it's just been kind of more of a rough and tumble state compared with other places. There was I think an increase in church attendance and overall religiosity starting in the later part of the 1800s into the 20th century with the migration of French Canadians to work in the big mills here in New Hampshire. And they were largely Catholic and brought in that Catholicism with them. And that kind of boosted and changed the nature of the state. But I think the Protestant denominations, they started at a lower level here in terms of their religiosity and probably have been declining at the same rate as the rest of the country.
I have an interesting question for you. When I think of New Hampshire and when I visit New Hampshire, it is cold, as an inhospitable climate for much of the year, and there's a lot of mountains. Um, what about that? Are there some physical, geographic, climatological reasons why people would be less religious, or is that too far-fetched?
I think that's probably going a little bit much because 2/3 of the population of the state lives within about 25, 30 miles of the Massachusetts border. Most of the population of New Hampshire is essentially in suburban Boston. The rural parts of the state with the mountains and the cold are largely unpopulated, and they've been losing population quite a bit over the last several decades as kind of the extractive industries of timber and paper making and so forth have been declining. So the largest town in the northern part of the country, northern part of the state, Berlin, which once had a population of 25 to 30,000 people, is down to about 10,000 people now. So the population of the more rural parts of the state, frankly, are older, and they tend to be more religious than the younger parts of the state where more people have moved in. So it's difficult, I think, to make some of those sweeping generalizations about geography. I think it's more who's living where that's different. And in the southeastern part of the state, we see lower levels of religiosity than other parts of the state.
We've been talking to Dr. Andrew Smith, who is the director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, and he has been at New Hampshire, studying New Hampshire, understanding New Hampshire, living in New Hampshire for decades now. And we really appreciate, Andy, you sharing with us and our listeners your insights, both empirical and impressionistic, about what's going on up in beautiful New England. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Frank, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this.
We're talking with Dr. Thomas S. Kidd now. He is the James Vardaman Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University, and he is a historian who spends a lot of time talking about the histories of religions. And Dr. Kidd, we thought of no better person to talk to than to try to give us some insights on why we see this very, very significant geographic disparity in the religiosity across the 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. Welcome back to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
First question, we know that the South is called the Bible Belt. When we do our Gallup rankings of religiosity, Mississippi is the most religious state in the Union, but a significant proportion of the top 10 states ranked on religiosity are in the so-called Bible Belt. Alabama, Tennessee, those states down in the South, with some, Utah, and put some other states in there with it for reasons of interest in and of themselves. But big picture, why is it that in this year, 2020, religion is so much higher in the southern states than it is elsewhere in the country?
Well, some of this it's always mysterious about why individual people decide to be religiously devout and why others don't. And so there's sort of the macro and the micro story. But there was a time in American history where the South was actually the least religious part of the country. In colonial America, New England was the most religious part of the country. And people in New England actually worried about the South because it seemed sort of benighted and bereft of churches and so forth. And I think that began to change really in probably the Revolutionary era and then the time of the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s, partly through the agency of New England missionaries. The most important early Baptist missionaries in the South were from New England. And they were Baptist missionaries, Methodist missionaries. Just part of the story is just incredible hard work on the part of itinerant pastors and evangelists through the period, say, from about 1800 to 1860. And they just successfully evangelized much of the South from, say, Virginia out to Texas. And so the South over time, and this is a story that applies to much of the Midwest as well, the South over time developed an infrastructure for religion that it hadn't had in the colonial period that was mostly a story of the growth of Baptists and Methodists. Churches of Christ are part of the story too, and some other groups, Presbyterians, but if you ever wonder, what's the story with every Southern and Midwestern town too, no matter how big it is, if you go to the middle of downtown, on one corner is the First Baptist Church and the other corner is the First Methodist Church. Well, that story had really been accomplished by the eve of the Civil War. And so it's on the eve of the Civil War, I think, that the South has become thoroughly Christianized. And that's also the time when America probably is at the height of its Christian commitment that it ever has had. Now, after the Civil War, there's a sort of bifurcation of Southern religion between white churches and black churches. Before then, whites and blacks tended to go to church together, not necessarily willingly on the part of African Americans, but the black population is being Christianized too during that period. But right after the Civil War, the black churches, by and large, go independent, and they're still overwhelmingly Baptist and Methodist, but they go independent. And so whites and blacks tend to be on a parallel but separate trajectory in the South. And so the South is overwhelmingly religious, not just because of white Christianity, but also because of African American Christianity. And so the black church becomes the defining social institution for African Americans in the South and other parts of the country, but especially in the South. And for whites, the Christianity in the aftermath of the Civil War becomes not just an important spiritual component of their culture, but also, I think, a political and cultural institution that kind of defines the defeated South in the Civil War. And it becomes, even more than for the country at large, it becomes essential for the white South that being Christian is a really important part of what it means to be American and to be Southern. And so there are other dynamics, of course, that have played out in the 150 years since that point. But I think, to me, by the end of the Civil War, you kind of have the pattern set by which the South becomes the most distinctively religious part of the country.
Dr. Kidd, we want to thank you for being with us on this podcast. As always, you've added tremendously to our understanding of this fascinating relationship between geography and religion in the United States. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Frank.
All right, Frank, so what do we know? What have we learned? We've heard a lot of discussion of different explanations. We've explored things from climate to racial demographics to history and sedentariness of populations versus migratoriness. What do you think?
Well, let's look at these one by one. First of all, religious identity. That's one of the first things we talked about. And we know that the states of the Union differ in religious identity. And we also know that different religious traditions have different levels of religiosity on average. We heard Dr. Smith talk about it, that New Hampshire's religious identity has been dominated more recently by mainline denominations. I think it was Catholic way back before that. And our data clearly show that the yield, if I can use that word, the yield from mainline denominations in terms of active participation is lower than in other Protestant faiths. So the fact that New Hampshire has a lot of mainline traditions means that on average they're going to get less church attendance because that's simply something that is associated with mainline Protestant denominations. And on the other hand, we know that the South is dominated by evangelical denominations, Protestant denominations, as we've been talking about. And we know that evangelical denominations have a much higher yield than most other faith traditions. So the mere fact that you've got Baptists and Methodists and other evangelical faiths down in the South means that on average we're going to have more active participation, more church attendance from those members, because that's what we find in general is associated with those types of faith.
And we looked at other differences in population composition and from within the states as well. Do they seem to make much of a difference?
No, just in review, I don't think those are major explanations, as we heard some of our guests talking about. There are clearly big differences in the percent of African American across the states in the Union, and that's important because African Americans tend to be more religious than any other major race or ethnic group in the country. But that's not the explanation for why southern states are so religious. Whites in those states are much more religious than whites in other states, as we talked about. There are differences in age and other demographics across the states. People tend to be older in some of the Midwestern and New England states, and actually older people tend to be more religious. But based on my analysis of the data, I don't see a lot of difference there. And you know, Nate, we are left with the one final explanation, which probably has more to do with this than anything else, and that is history and culture and differences in migration patterns over the years. And we heard that a lot from our guests. You'll remember Dr. Smith talked about the kind of people that have moved into New Hampshire, and in particular, type of people that have moved into or left Vermont up in New England. Dr. Kidd told us a lot about what's happened down in the South, and not only in terms of migration, but in terms of these great revival movements, the Great Awakening, the Great Revival that came through in the 1800s, where there was a lot of evangelism down in the South, and that apparently seems to have stuck in the South. So I think these kinds of explanations that have to do with the history, the people that have moved in and what's happened to those people once they've been there, have a lot to do with why we have even today this difference in religiosity across the states. Keep in mind that you didn't have this gigantic evangelism sticking up in the Northeast or up in the Northwest at the same time that you did down in the South, and we may be still seeing the residue of those kinds of movements today in the South, and that helps explain why they're so religious, and also types of people. I think it's interesting to try to examine the kind of people in Vermont, as Dr. Smith talked about. They may just be the kind of people who are there, who are left there, who've moved there, who simply aren't that interested in having religion as a major part of their daily life. So I think probably when you put it all together, Nate, the most potent explanation for the differences in religiosity across states has to do with these traditions. The history, the things that have happened to these states over the centuries, actually, since this country was founded.
Jen, the stereotype of the South is that the roots grow really deep there. So people down in the South will have generational impact, and that history will still be relevant for them today. But there is kind of an increase in the mixing as people become more transitory for jobs and work. And we've kind of seen that. And that's an explanation there for Utah, how that was really shaped by that. So it'll be interesting as we look forward into the future to see whether this sticks or whether this starts getting mixed up. As it is, there doesn't appear to be any one smoking gun explanation that explains 100% of the reasons, but there are a few different factors that play into it.
And I think you put your finger on something that's very, very important for us to end with. It's the fact that these norms have persisted. I mean, we're sitting here recording this now, Nate, in the year 2020. And we've still got the same kind of differences in religiosity that survey researchers found back in the 60s and 50s. And had there been surveys prior to that, I think we probably would have found the same kind of differences going back decades and decades and decades. So the people have come and gone. You know, most of the people who were living in Mississippi and New Hampshire, let's say 80 years ago, have died. They've been replaced by new people. And yet these norms, these traditions have continued in these states. So that's one of the fascinating things to me about sociology and social science, is how these kind of cultural patterns can be established, these norms, these social facts, as the sociologist Emil Durkheim once called them, that kind of control what's going on in a region or a state in the instances that we're talking about here, and the people come and go. The people leave, they die, new people come in, and yet these norms kind of live on as people come and go, regardless of who those particular people are. And that's what's fascinating here. They're just strong cultural norms above and beyond the particular populations who happen to be living there at any given time in the South to dictate a high level of religiosity. And apparently there are some strong cultural norms in states in the Northeast and in the Northwest and some other Western states that simply dictate a low level of religiosity, and those norms seem to be persisting year after year, decade after decade. But as you say, Nate, let's meet here on this podcast in 20 years and look at an update in the data and see if things have changed.
Well, until then, I'm Nate Brantingham.
And I'm Frank Newport, and you've been listening to our podcast, Objective Religion, conducted in partnership with Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion.
As always, if you like this podcast, please rate and subscribe on iTunes or your platform of choice, share, and give us feedback. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.